In the winter of 897, a dead pope was pulled from his grave, dressed in full papal vestments, propped up on a throne, and put on trial for crimes against the church. His corpse was given a lawyer. The room was filled with living clergy, forced to sit in silence while his successor screamed accusations at a body that had been in the ground for 9 months. It sounds like the fever dream of a civilization coming apart at the seams. But why would the most powerful religious institution in the world go to the trouble of prosecuting a man it had already buried? In January of 897, in a cold Roman basilica, a dead man needed a lawyer. The corpse in question belonged to Pope Formosus, who had died roughly 7 months earlier and was not, by any conventional measure, in a position to defend himself. This had not stopped Pope Stephen VI from having him dug up, dressed in full papal vestments, propped upright on a throne, and formally charged with perjury, violating church canon, and coveting the papacy. The Catholic Church has had complicated moments in its long history. This was one of them. Picture the room. January in Rome, so the air carries that particular winter chill, the kind that settles into stone floors and never quite leaves. The basilica would have smelled of incense and candle wax, the eternal perfume of ecclesiastical power. And underneath it, something else. Something the incense was working very hard to cover. Formosus had been dead since April. The embalmers had done what they could, but vestments and ceremony only go so far when a body has had 7 months to develop its own opinions about decomposition. Church officials, bishops, and clergy lined the walls, required to witness this proceeding. Required, one imagines, to keep their expressions very carefully neutral. At the center of it all stood Pope Stephen VI, a man whose approach to conflict resolution might generously be described as unconventional. He stood before the corpse and screamed at it. Actual screaming, recorded by witnesses, directed at the sunken face of his predecessor. He demanded to know why Formosus had betrayed his vows. He demanded answers about political appointments made years earlier. The body, exercising its right to remain silent, said nothing. This is where the lawyer comes in. Someone had to speak for the dead pope, and that someone was a terrified young deacon whose name history has, mercifully, not fully preserved. He stood behind the propped-up corpse, crammed into what was quite literally the most uncomfortable position of his entire career, and attempted to mount a legal defense on behalf of a man who could not nod, blink, or offer the faintest signal of approval. Imagine rehearsing those arguments the night before. Imagine deciding what to wear. The deacon spoke softly, haltingly, aware that whatever he said, the conclusion had likely been decided before anyone picked up a shovel. He was not wrong. This was the Cadaver Synod, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A formal ecclesiastical trial conducted against a dead man in full ceremony with witnesses and charges and a defense counsel and a verdict. It happened not in some fever dream or medieval morality play, but in real life, in a real building, with real people who had to stand there and pretend this was a normal use of everyone's afternoon. The Catholic Church would eventually declare the whole proceeding invalid. But that came later, after the verdict, after the consequences, and after things got considerably worse for several people who were still technically alive. Which brings us to what happened next. By the late 900s, Rome was a city held together largely by memory and wishful thinking. The population had collapsed from perhaps 800,000 at the imperial peak to somewhere around 30,000, a number so reduced that the old city had essentially swallowed its own inhabitants. Roman citizens, if you could call them that with a straight face, were living inside the ruins of a civilization their ancestors had built. The Colosseum had become a quarry and a neighborhood. Aqueducts that once carried millions of gallons of water daily sat cracked and dry, their elegant arches slowly returning to the earth. The forums were pasture land. Actual cows grazed between the columns of temples where senators had once plotted the fate of the world. The smell of a 9th century city is not a thing most of us pause to consider, probably for the best. Without functioning aqueducts, you simply made do. Waste disposal was, let us say, interpretive. And over all of it hung the particular weight of a place that had once been everything and now wasn't quite sure what it was anymore. Into this atmospheric setting, enter the papacy, the spiritual heart of Western Christianity, a beacon of moral authority. Also, in practical terms, an office that powerful families treated like a particularly high-stakes inheritance dispute. The Bishop of Rome was extraordinarily useful. He could crown emperors, legitimize dynasties, and issue decisions that shaped law and land ownership across half a continent. Naturally, everyone wanted to control him. Ideally, everyone wanted to be him. The larger chaos arrived courtesy of the Carolingian Empire, which had been coming apart at the seams for decades and finally, decisively, tore itself open in 887 when Charles the Fat was deposed. Charles had been the last emperor to hold something resembling unified Frankish authority over Western Europe. After him, the empire fractured into competing kingdoms and the Italian peninsula became a free market for ambition. Two families rose immediately to fill the vacuum. The Spolletans, based in central Italy, were aggressive, militarily capable, and had absolutely no patience for rivals. The House of Friuli was similarly positioned and similarly motivated. Both wanted the Italian crown. Both understood that controlling the Pope was a useful shortcut to legitimacy. The papal throne, already fragile, now sat directly in the crossfire between them. This is the world that made the Cadaver Synod possible. Not madness emerging from nowhere, but a political climate so volatile, so thoroughly poisoned by dynastic violence, that desecrating a corpse in the name of legal procedure barely registered as unusual. To understand who put Formosus on trial, we need to understand who needed him gone and why. Formosus was ordained Bishop of Porto around 864, and from the beginning, he was the kind of man who made other men nervous. Porto was a small diocese just outside Rome, the sort of posting that could have been a comfortable, unremarkable career. Formosus treated it as a launching pad. When Pope Nicholas I needed someone to carry Christianity into the unconverted territories of Bulgaria, he sent Formosus. It was a genuinely dangerous assignment. Long roads, uncertain rulers, the very real possibility that a missionary's welcome could turn cold before supper. Formosus thrived. Bulgarian Khan Boris I was so impressed that he wrote to Rome with a specific request. He wanted Formosus made Archbishop of Bulgaria permanently. That letter caused a problem, not for Boris, for Formosus. The request was flattering, and that was precisely why it was dangerous. A bishop accumulating foreign admirers, building his own base of influence beyond Rome's direct control, inspiring rulers of emerging kingdoms to write personal letters on his behalf? The papal court had a word for that. Several words, actually, and most of them were accusations. Pope John VIII was not a man who appreciated competition in any form. By 876, his patience with Formosus had run out entirely. The charges came in a rush. conspiring to seize the papacy for himself, abandoning his diocese without permission, conducting himself in ways unbecoming a man of the cloth, and various other offenses that blur together the way charges always do when the real offense is simply being too capable and too popular. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. What mattered was that John VIII had the authority and the motivation to act. Formosus was excommunicated. He fled Rome ahead of whatever came next, which was wise. He was tried in absentia, stripped of his priestly functions, and required, under oath, to never return to Rome and never again exercise any clerical role. It was, for all practical purposes, the end of his life in the church. Comfortable early retirement if you squinted at it generously. He did not retire. Pope John VIII died in 882. Murdered, as it happens, first poisoned and then clubbed to death by his own entourage, which tells you everything about the working conditions at the papal court. His successor cycled through office with alarming speed. Pope Marinus I, who took power that same year, had a different view of Formosus entirely. Perhaps he valued the man's evident talents. Perhaps he simply wanted a political ally. Either way, Marinus lifted the excommunication, restored Formosus to his diocese, and quietly returned him to the machinery of Roman Church politics. The oath was forgotten. The exile ended. Formosus came home. He had survived excommunication, exile, a sworn renunciation of everything he cared about, and the death of the man who had ruined him. He was patient, talented, and apparently impossible to permanently dispose of, which is either an inspiring quality or a warning sign, depending on where you were sitting. And in a few short years, enough people would be worried enough about that quality that they would take truly extraordinary measures to settle the matter once and for all. October 891, and Formosus finally had the job he had spent 30 years being accused of wanting. Whether he actually wanted it is another question. Canon law had a clear position on bishops transferring between sees. You didn't. A bishop was bound to his diocese the way a husband was bound to his wife, which is to say permanently, and with considerable paperwork if things went wrong. Formosus was Bishop of Porto. Becoming Bishop of Rome, which is to say Pope, meant breaking that rule in the most visible way imaginable. His enemies would remember this. They were already sharpening the argument like a knife and setting it on a shelf for later. But the enemies were everywhere, and some of them were considerably more immediate than canon lawyers. Rome in 891 was not a city so much as a prize being fought over by several parties who each considered themselves the rightful winners. The Spalatin faction had arrived first and stayed longest. Guy III, Duke of Spoleto, had already muscled his way into the title of Holy Roman Emperor the previous year, and he and his son Lambert were not subtle about their relationship with the papacy. The relationship was, broadly, do what we say. Formosus had barely settled into office before he was crowning Guy's son Lambert as co-emperor in 892, which is the kind of ceremony that feels less like a blessing and more like a receipt. Imagine performing the holiest rites of your office with a man standing just behind your shoulder, not to assist you but to make sure you didn't stop. Formosus performed the ceremony. He smiled presumably. He handed over the crown. And then, quietly, almost immediately, he began writing letters in the other direction. Arnulf of Carinthia was everything the Spalatins were not, which made him extremely appealing to a pope who had just spent 2 years being supervised. Arnulf was a Carolingian king, legitimate heir to the great Frankish tradition, and he had his own ambitions regarding the imperial title. Formosus invited him south. Liberate Rome, the letter suggested. The papacy would be grateful. There was an imperial crown in it for him. This was, to be charitable, an enormous gamble. Arnulf marched in 896. He was spectacularly effective for approximately 3 weeks. His forces broke through Roman defenses with a directness that must have felt, to Formosus, like answered prayer. Arnulf knelt before the aging pope, received the imperial crown in April of that year, and everything seemed, briefly, resolved. Then Arnulf suffered a stroke. His army, suddenly leaderless and far from home, retreated north. The Spolitans, who were still very much alive and now possessed of detailed knowledge of exactly what Formosus had done behind their backs, watched the Frankish army disappear over the Alps. Formosus died in April 896, perhaps 4 days after Arnulf's departure, before the full consequences of his double dealing could arrive at his door. The consequences arrived anyway. They simply had to wait a few months, gather some rope, and figure out where to find a chair small enough to fit a corpse. Formosus was dead by April 4th, 896, and Rome wasted almost no time mourning before it started fighting over what came next. The scramble for succession was, to put it gently, undignified. Within days, a man named Boniface VI was wearing the papal tiara. He had been elected by popular acclamation, which sounds democratic until you learn that popular acclamation in 9th century Rome meant whoever the loudest faction in the street wanted. Boniface lasted 15 days. 15. The official explanation was gout, which is technically a disease and not a murder, and yet the speed of his removal has delighted suspicious historians for 11 centuries. One pope dead, one pope gone in a fortnight. The throne was available again before the candles from the last funeral had fully cooled. Into this gap stepped Stephen VI. He was, by most accounts, not a calming presence. Stephen was a Spolitan loyalist, elevated with the enthusiastic backing of the people who had every reason to despise everything Formosus had stood for and done. He was also, by several contemporary accounts, a man who took things personally, which is a quality that tends to be inconvenient in priests and catastrophic in popes. The real architects behind Stephen's elevation, however, were not sitting on any throne themselves. Lambert of Spoleto, young, furious, and recently embarrassed by the Frankish invasion his mother had spent years working to prevent, wanted accountability. His mother, Ageltrude, wanted it more. She was, by the standards of the era, a remarkable political operator, having essentially governed the Spolitan interests through her husband's death and her son's early reign. The Franks had marched into Rome, her Rome, with papal blessing. Someone was going to answer for that. Formosus had the profound inconvenience of being unavailable for comment. This did not stop anyone. Ageltrude and Lambert needed a pope who would do something, and Stephen VI, burning with personal grievance and surrounded by powerful patrons, was exactly the instrument the moment required. He was elected sometime in 896, and he began making plans almost immediately. Large plans. Unprecedented plans. Plans that required, among other things, a shovel. The Spolitans had found their weapon. They had their pope, their grudge, and the full weight of northern Italian military power behind them. The only remaining question was whether you could prosecute a man who was already in the ground. Stephen, it turned out, was quite confident you could. And he had a very specific vision of how the trial should be conducted, right down to the seating arrangements. The gravediggers worked in January of 897 in the cold beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in a crypt that smelled of stone and old incense and things better left undisturbed. Formosus had been in the ground for 9 months. What they pulled out was, by contemporary accounts, still recognizable, which is either a miracle of the Roman winter or a detail the chroniclers added to make the subsequent events feel even more deliberate. It takes intention to dress a corpse in full pontifical vestments. It takes something harder to name to then prop it on a throne and declare court in session. The vestments themselves deserve a moment of consideration. Heavy silk, gold embroidery, the layers of ceremonial dress that a living pope would require attendants to properly arrange. Someone had to fit all of that onto a body that had spent 9 months becoming something other than a body. The pallium draped over shoulders that no longer held their shape. The papal tiara balanced on a head that required, according to some sources, physical propping to stay upright. This was not improvised. This was prepared. Stephen VI had planned this the way you plan a banquet, with attention to the guest list and the seating and the spectacle of the occasion. The charges read against Formosus were, on their surface, canonical. The core accusation was that Formosus had illegally transferred his bishopric from Porto to Rome, a genuine violation of church law if you squinted at it correctly, and ignored decades of precedent and the emergency circumstances that had brought him to the papacy in the first place. If the transfer was illegal, then his papacy was invalid. If his papacy was invalid, then every ordination he had ever performed was null. Every land grant he had issued, void. Every appointment, meaningless. And, most critically, every coronation he had ever conducted carried no more weight than a theatrical performance. You see where this is going? Because Formosus, in 891, had crowned Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor, which was precisely the act the Spartans had spent 6 years trying to undo. The theology was the mechanism. The real claim was territorial and political and furious. This was never about whether a bishop could transfer his seat. This was about Lambert of Spoleto wanting his title back and Ageltrude wanting the Frankish intervention erased from history by legal fiat. To make the spectacle function, Stephen required a defense. Canon law, even when being stretched to its absolute breaking point, maintains certain forms. So, a teenage deacon was assigned to speak for the corpse. Imagine being that young man, standing in a room that smelled of decay and burning candles, and the particular anxiety of being the only person present whose life might actually be at stake, required to defend a dead pope against a living one who was also serving as prosecutor, judge, and primary beneficiary of the outcome. The deacon reportedly said very little. One cannot entirely blame him. Stephen, by contrast, said a great deal. Contemporary accounts describe him screaming at the body, addressing it directly, demanding answers from a man who had none left to give. Whether this was theatrical intimidation, genuine psychological fracture, or simply what happens when a person has held a grievance long enough that they no longer require the object of it to be responsive, historians have been debating for 11 centuries. The answer is probably that all three are true and none of them are mutually exclusive. The verdict was never in question. It had been decided before the shovel broke the crypt floor in January. The trial was the performance, and the performance required an audience and a conclusion and the satisfying legal fiction that everything had been done properly with witnesses and charges and a representative for the deceased. What it also required before it could proceed to the voiding of every act Formosus had ever performed, was the full stripping of those carefully arranged vestments from the corpse. That part came next. And after that, the question of what exactly you do with a defrocked pope who is already dead. Stephen VI did not wait for the formalities to conclude before he started screaming. The question he returned to again and again was this: why did you usurp the See of Rome? He directed it at the corpse with the full force of a man who had been rehearsing the line for months. The corpse offered no reply. The deacon, standing in for the corpse, offered something barely louder than silence, a few mumbled words swallowed immediately by the incense-thick air of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The assembled clergy sat without moving. Nobody in that room, surrounded by the smell of decomposition and the heat of a winter trial held indoors with too many candles, wanted to be noticed. The verdict, when it came, was total. Formosus was found guilty on every count. His papacy was declared illegitimate. His pontifical acts were annulled. Every land grant void. Every ecclesiastical appointment canceled. And every ordination he had ever performed across his entire career retroactively meaningless. The bishops and priests he had consecrated were no longer bishops and priests. The deacons were no longer deacons. Hundreds of men whose entire identities, incomes, and social positions were built on the legitimacy of their holy orders woke up the following morning in a kind of canonical free fall. They had not changed. The law had simply decided they had never existed in the form they believed themselves to be. The coronation of Arnulf of Carinthia, performed by Formosus in 891, was erased in the same stroke. On paper, at least, Lambert of Spoleto had his title back. 6 years of political grievance resolved by a guilty verdict delivered to a 9-month-old corpse. Efficient, if nothing else. Then came the vestments. They stripped them off the body there in the basilica, which required a kind of close physical contact with the remains that no contemporary account dwells on for obvious reasons. The pallium removed, the tiara taken away. The heavy silk layers peeled back until what remained on the throne was simply a body and no longer, legally or symbolically, a pope. And then, to ensure the humiliation was permanent and legible, someone took a blade to the right hand and removed the 3 fingers used for the blessing gesture. The physical sign of papal authority hacked off and discarded. Don't worry, it gets worse. The body was dragged out of the basilica through the streets of Rome. Contemporary accounts differ on whether a crowd gathered or whether most of Rome had the sense to find somewhere else to be that afternoon. Either way, the procession ended at the Tiber, and Formosus was thrown in. He had been buried in St. Peter's. He had been disinterred for trial. He had been tried, convicted, mutilated, stripped, and drowned in a river while already dead. As final indignities go, it was thorough. What Stephen VI had not calculated in all his meticulous planning was what happened next. Not to the corpse. To him. The people of Rome had watched all of this, and they had formed an opinion. That opinion was about to find him. A monk whose name history has almost entirely forgotten pulled the body of Formosus from the Tiber sometime in the weeks following the synod. The river had not been kind to him, but it had not taken him far. The current deposited the former pope somewhere along the bank south of the city, where the monk found him, wrapped the body in whatever cloth was available, and hid it. This was not a small act. Stephen VI was still very much in power, and being caught sheltering the remains of a condemned heretic pope was exactly the kind of thing that ended careers, and occasionally people. But the monk hid the body anyway, and then the rumors started. Stories spread through Rome the way they always do in cities with too many people living too close together, passed across market stalls and whispered in courtyards. The body had been recovered intact. The body had performed miracles. The icons of saints in Rome, according to some accounts, had bowed their heads when Formosus was returned from the water, which is either deeply moving or extremely suspicious depending on your threshold for credulity. The Romans, exhausted and outraged and looking for a sign, were not feeling skeptical that season. Grief has a way of creating its own evidence. Then the earthquake hit. Shortly after the Cadaver Synod concluded, a substantial tremor struck Rome and damaged the Lateran Basilica, the same building, the same walls that had held the stench and the spectacle and the screaming. The Romans interpreted this with the subtlety you might expect from a population that had just watched their bishop conduct a trial against a 9-month-old corpse. God, they concluded, was not pleased. The earthquake read less like a geological event and more like a 1-star review from the divine. Stephen VI had gambled that spectacular brutality would consolidate his position. Instead, he had handed his enemies a narrative. Every cracked wall in the Lateran was a sermon he hadn't written. Every miracle story circulating through the city was a brick removed from his foundation. The clergy, who had sat silent and terrified through the synod, began quietly recalculating. These were men whose own ordinations might be called into question next, whose positions rested on the same kind of legitimacy Stephen had just demonstrated he was willing to annihilate for political convenience. The support that had carried him into the papacy started to thin, the way support always thins when people realize the weapon being used might eventually point at them. By the summer of 897, the mood in Rome had curdled completely. The populace, the clergy, and enough of the Roman nobility to matter had arrived at the same quiet conclusion. Stephen VI had gone too far, and more practically, he had gone too far in a way that had made all of them look complicit. What followed was swift, and had the particular energy of a city that had been holding its breath for months. The man who had put a corpse on trial was about to discover what it felt like to lose everything, not through a verdict, but through a door that opened the wrong way. The summer revolt came fast and without ceremony. Stephen VI was stripped of his papal vestments, which is the ecclesiastical equivalent of being escorted from the building by security while your colleagues pretend to find something very interesting to look at on their desks. He was thrown into a Roman prison in 897, and there, within weeks, someone strangled him in his cell. History does not record who gave the order. History rarely does in these situations. What history records is the outcome. The man who had orchestrated the most grotesque trial in papal history died alone in the dark, which is either divine justice or coincidence, depending, again, on your threshold for credulity. He had written this ending for others. He simply hadn't imagined himself in the role. What followed his death was the kind of institutional chaos that makes medievalists reach for a second cup of tea and a flowchart. Rome burned through popes the way a bad restaurant burns through health inspectors. Romanus lasted 4 months. Theodore II lasted 20 days. 20 days. That is barely enough time to learn where the good wine is kept in the Lateran palace, let alone consolidate a papacy. John IX arrived in 898 and immediately convened a synod. not to try anyone, dead or alive, but to undo what Stephen had done. He rehabilitated Formosus. He annulled the Cadaver Synod's findings. He burned the written records of the proceedings, which suggests that even contemporaries understood that documentation of the event was more liability than legacy. But it was Theodore II who did the thing that no one had quite expected. In his brief, flickering 20-day reign, he ordered the body of Formosus recovered, dressed once more in full papal vestments, and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with complete papal honors. The man Stephen had stripped, tried, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber was returned to the most sacred ground in Christendom, fingers and all, given back the dignity that had been so elaborately, so publicly destroyed. Imagine being a Roman citizen watching that procession, watching the church quietly, efficiently, unwind a year of spectacular horror as though it were a clerical error. The 9 popes in 8 years were not an anomaly. They were a symptom. Rome had entered what historians would later call, with characteristic understatement, a period of instability, one where the papacy became a prize that powerful families seized, held briefly, and lost violently. The Cadaver Synod had not caused this, but it had announced it, like the first crack in a wall before the ceiling comes down. Stephen had wanted to destroy Formosus so thoroughly that the man's influence, his ordinations, his entire papal legacy would simply cease to exist. He had wanted to rewrite the record. And here is the dark, exquisite irony that history occasionally delivers with the precision of someone who has been waiting patiently to make a point. It worked perfectly in reverse. Before the Cadaver Synod, Formosus was a controversial pope whose complicated reign was already fading from active memory, a man who would have become a footnote. Stephen VI, through 9 months of obsessive theatrical persecution that culminated in dressing a decomposing body in vestments and screaming at it in a courtroom, guaranteed that Formosus would never be forgotten. He guaranteed that his own name would survive only in direct association with that image. The two of them are locked together now across 11 centuries, the dead man in the chair and the man who put him there. Stephen tried to erase Formosus and succeeded only in making them inseparable. The body was back in St. Peter's. The records were ash. The Pope who had ordered all of it was in an unmarked grave. And Rome, battered and exhausted and thoroughly scandalized, was left to ask itself how exactly things had gotten this bad. The answer, as it so often is, began much earlier, with power and politics, and men who believed the church was a mechanism they could simply aim. The family that would come to own the papacy like a country estate kept meticulous records of their acquisitions. The Theophylax, a Roman aristocratic clan of considerable wealth and zero subtlety, rose to dominate papal elections in the early 10th century with the quiet confidence of people who had simply decided that God's representative on earth would be whoever they found convenient. Theophylact I held the title count of Tusculum and, more importantly, controlled the military and financial apparatus of Rome. The papacy, in practical terms, became a subsidiary. Historians have called this period the pornocracy, which sounds dramatic until you learn it simply means rule of the harlots, a reference to the women of the Theophylact family who wielded extraordinary behind-the-scenes influence. Marozia, Theophylact's daughter, was particularly effective. She reportedly had a son by Pope Sergius III, helped murder one pope, imprisoned another, and eventually installed her own son as Pope John XI in 931. She did all of this while also managing a political marriage and maintaining a reputation formidable enough that contemporaries found her worth recording. Whether in admiration or horror is, honestly, a matter of interpretation. Sergius III deserves a moment of specific attention because he arrived in 904 and did something remarkable. He reaffirmed the Cadaver Synod. He looked at the event the rest of Rome had spent 7 years trying to quietly bury and decided, formally, that Stephen VI had been correct. He also, according to sources hostile to him, arranged the murders of his 2 immediate predecessors, Leo V and Christopher, while they sat in prison. Efficient, if not exactly pastoral. What the Cadaver Synod had exposed, and what the following century confirmed in excruciating detail, was a structural vulnerability at the heart of the institution. The papacy had no reliable mechanism for protecting itself from the city it sat inside. Secular power could reach directly into the election, the reign, and the corpse of any given pope, and the church had limited formal tools to stop it. The canon law reforms that eventually emerged, centuries later, including new rules preventing bishops from transferring between sees, rules designed precisely to stop the political maneuvering that had defined Formosis's career, grew from the scar tissue of exactly this period. The Cadaver Synod had not broken the papacy. It had simply shown everyone where the walls were thinnest. And the Theophylacts, comfortable by the fire in their Tusculan estate, had taken very careful notes. What came next was not chaos. It was something considerably more organized, which, in certain circumstances, is much worse. On the 30th of January, 1661, Oliver Cromwell was hanged. This was admittedly a logistical challenge because Cromwell had been dead for over 2 years. Parliament dug him up anyway, dressed the body, dragged it to Tyburn, and subjected it to a full ceremonial execution. His head was then removed and mounted on a spike outside Westminster Hall, where it remained for approximately 24 years, rattling in the London wind, serving as a warning to absolutely no one who was still alive to be warned. The skull eventually blew down in a storm, passed through the hands of private collectors, and was not formally buried until 1960. 300 years after his execution, the man could not catch a break. The Cadaver Synod had not been an aberration. It had been a template. Because the living have always needed something from the dead that the dead can no longer give willingly, and a trial. Whether formal or theatrical, whether held in a 9th century Roman church or a public square in Bristol, is the mechanism by which the living take it anyway. In June of 2020, a crowd in Bristol wrapped a rope around the bronze neck of Edward Colston, a 17th century slave trader whose statue had stood in the city center since 1895, and pulled. The statue went into the harbor with a sound that was, by most accounts, enormously satisfying. Colston had been dead for 300 years. The harbor received him anyway. The debate that followed about history and accountability and who gets commemorated in public space was not really about Colston. It was about Bristol and what Bristol wanted to say about itself in 2020. The dead man was the occasion. The living were the audience. Posthumous pardons work on the same logic, just with more paperwork. In 2013, the British government granted a royal pardon to Alan Turing, the mathematician who had broken the Enigma code and been chemically castrated by the state in 1952 for the crime of being gay. The pardon was meaningful to the people who campaigned for it. Turing, having died in 1954, was less available for comment. The Guildford Four, wrongfully convicted of IRA bombings, were exonerated in 1989 while still very much alive. Their rehabilitation was justice. Turing's pardon was something slightly different. It was a society holding a mirror to itself and deciding, formally, that it preferred a different reflection. This is the thread that runs from Pope Stephen VI dragging Formosus out of his tomb to every posthumous verdict handed down since. Power over a person does not end at death. It simply changes courtrooms. The corpse is not the defendant. The corpse is the evidence. The real trial is always about the present. Who holds authority? Whose legacy survives? What story gets told in the public square? And whose name gets mounted on a spike or scrubbed from a building or, occasionally, pardoned with great ceremony by people who bear no personal cost for the gesture? Formosus never got his pardon. What he got instead was a papacy full of chaos, a century of institutional reckoning, and, eventually, the canon law that still shapes the church today. Which is, depending on your view, either a terrible legacy or a surprisingly durable one.